In the stark, unforgiving light of a congressional hearing room, political careers can be made or broken in a matter of minutes. This is the story of one such moment, an explosive exchange that Washington, D.C. would be talking about for weeks. It began with a seasoned senator's calculated, mocking attack on a freshman congresswoman, an attempt to publicly humiliate her and dismiss her expertise. But what he intended as a swift political takedown quickly transformed into a masterclass in preparation, poise, and the devastating power of documented facts. This is the story of how a single manila folder, wielded with the precision of a trial lawyer, turned a political ambush on its head. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was bathed in the harsh, flat light of television cameras, a stage designed not for comfort but for confrontation. The air was already charged with a low-grade tension as staffers exchanged nervous glances and reporters hunched over their laptops, their fingers poised. For 3 hours, the hearing on the proposed Voting Rights Advancement Act had followed a predictable script. Senators had grilled expert witnesses along familiar partisan lines, reciting rehearsed talking points for the C-SPAN cameras. It was the usual Washington theater. Then, the script was torn to shreds when Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas took her seat at the witness table. A subtle shift rippled through the room. As a freshman congresswoman invited to testify, she presented what many saw as an easy target for a seasoned committee member looking to score political points. At least, that's what Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri seemed to think as he adjusted his microphone, a look of unmistakable confidence on his face. Crockett, however, arranged her materials with a calm, methodical precision, a leather portfolio, a slim tablet, and a single, unassuming manila folder, which she placed strategically at her fingertips. Her expression revealed nothing, but those who had followed her career recognized the composed demeanor of a former civil rights attorney who had faced down far more intimidating opponents than a politician armed with soundbites. Hawley began, his voice carrying the polished, prosecutorial edge of a former state attorney general. Representative Crockett, before you lectured this committee about election law, perhaps you could explain your own questionable understanding of constitutional principles. The camera caught the slight raise of Crockett's eyebrow. It was not a look of surprise, but of recognition. This was not a question. It was the opening salvo in a calculated attack. Hawley had positioned himself as one of the bill's most vocal opponents, framing it as a dangerous federal overreach. His questioning of previous witnesses had been aggressive, but with Crockett, his tone became noticeably dismissive, almost condescending. You've made some rather bold claims, Hawley continued, making derisive air quotes with his fingers, calling state voting laws modern Jim Crow. Pretty inflammatory rhetoric from someone who's been a member of Congress for what? A year and a half? Perhaps you could share what constitutional law experience qualifies you to make such serious accusations. The implication was clear. She was an inexperienced, emotional novice, unqualified to debate with a seasoned constitutional scholar like himself. It was a classic tactic, designed to undermine her credibility before she could even present her case. What Hawley had failed to research was that Jasmine Crockett was arguably one of the most qualified people in that room to discuss this very topic. Her years as a voting rights attorney, her published legal articles, and her experience clerking for a federal judge had prepared her for this exact moment. 2 days earlier, she had told her staff, "They will try to discredit me personally rather than engage with the substance. Senator Hawley, in particular, will attack my credentials. We need to be ready." The manila folder sitting on the witness table was the result of that preparation, a compendium of documented facts that would turn what Hawley intended as a dismissive attack into a powerful correction of the record. Hawley pressed on, playing to the cameras. The American people are tired of being lectured about how their state voting laws are somehow racist by politicians who can't even articulate what constitutional principles are at stake. So, please, enlighten the committee. What specific constitutional law expertise do you bring to this discussion? What cases have you personally litigated that give you this authority? He sat back, a slight smile on his face, clearly expecting an emotional, defensive response that he could easily dismantle. Jasmine Crockett reached calmly for the manila folder. The room fell silent. "Thank you for that question, Senator Hawley," she began, her voice steady and controlled. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify my qualifications for this committee. Jasmine Crockett opened the manila folder with deliberate calm. The committee room, which had been buzzing with the energy of Senator Hawley's attack, fell silent. The pause was a strategic choice. A moment of quiet that created a powerful sense of anticipation. To directly address your question about my constitutional law experience, Senator, she began, her voice steady and controlled. I served as lead counsel in Davis v. Texas Board of Elections, which successfully challenged discriminatory voter ID provisions under the 14th and 15th Amendments. I was also co-counsel in Jackson County NAACP v. Williams, a case which restored early voting locations that had been unconstitutionally removed from predominantly minority neighborhoods. Hawley's expression flickered, a momentary uncertainty crossing his face. He had expected a defensive, emotional response. Instead, he was being met with specific, verifiable case citations. Over my legal career, Crockett continued, her tone as even as a judge reading a verdict. I have litigated 17 voting rights cases in federal court, including 3 that reached the appellate level. Before joining Congress, I also published articles on voting rights jurisprudence in the Harvard Journal on Legislation and the Georgetown Law Review. She turned a page in her folder, her gaze unwavering. Would you like me to provide the citations for those publications, Senator? I have copies right here if you'd like to review them. The cameras captured the moment perfectly. Hawley, who had attempted to frame her as an unqualified amateur, was now being offered a reading list. The confident dismissal on his face had shifted to something less certain. That's not necessary, he interjected, attempting to regain control of the exchange. The point remains that these state laws you're so quick to criticize were passed by duly elected representatives. I'm glad you raised that point about representation, Senator, Crockett responded, smoothly turning his argument to her advantage. Because when we discuss the role of elected representatives, we must first ensure that the electoral process itself provides equal and unimpeded access to all eligible voters, as is guaranteed by the 15th Amendment and has been upheld in numerous Supreme Court decisions, including South Carolina v. Katzenbach, a case I'm sure you're familiar with from your own legal background. The reference to a landmark Supreme Court precedent was another strategic shot across the bow. A clear signal that this was a legal discussion in which Crockett was thoroughly prepared to engage. Hawley shifted his approach again, his tone hardening. The Constitution clearly gives states the primary responsibility for conducting elections. Are you suggesting that you understand the founders' intent better than the state legislators who are simply implementing common-sense security measures? It was a classic deflection, an attempt to move the debate from specific legal questions to abstract appeals to founders' intent and security. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. The historical record on this question is particularly interesting, Senator. While Article 1, Section 4 does indeed give states initial authority over election procedures, that very same clause explicitly grants Congress the power, at any time, to make or alter such regulations regarding federal elections. She delivered the constitutional citation from memory, a detail not lost on those watching. In fact, she added, Alexander Hamilton addressed this specific balance in Federalist 59, where he warned against leaving election regulation exclusively to the states, precisely because it could be used to undermine representative democracy. Would you like me to quote his exact language on this point? The hearing room had gone remarkably still. This was not the expected political theater. It was a methodical dismantling of a flawed argument, piece by piece, by someone with an evident and deep expertise in the subject matter. Senator Hawley, realizing his line of questioning had completely backfired, was now trapped in a constitutional law seminar he had inadvertently enrolled himself in. Senator Hawley, realizing his line of questioning about Crockett's credentials had backfired spectacularly, attempted to pivot again, this time to empirical data. The real issue here is practical, not theoretical, he asserted, trying to regain his footing. These states are simply implementing common-sense measures to prevent fraud. I'm glad you've raised the empirical question, Senator, Crockett interjected smoothly, because that allows us to move from constitutional theory to documented evidence. She retrieved a single, crisp page from her folder. According to the Heritage Foundation's own database on election fraud, a source I believe you've cited favorably in previous hearings, the actual documented rate of voter fraud over the past 20 years amounts to approximately 0.00006% of total ballots cast. She let the number hang in the air. For context, you are statistically more likely to be struck by lightning than to encounter a single case of in-person voter impersonation fraud. She placed the document on the table. This analysis comes not from so-called partisan sources, but from multiple studies conducted by both Republican and Democratic administrations. I've included the citations to the original research if you'd like to review the methodology. The strategic citation of a conservative think tank's own data was devastating. It prevented Hawley from dismissing the statistics as biased while simultaneously highlighting the massive disconnect between the claimed justification for the restrictive voting laws and the documented reality. Senator Hawley's face had flushed a slight, but noticeable, shade of red. What began as a confident attempt to diminish Crockett's expertise had instead provided her a national platform to demonstrate it comprehensively. Worse still, her calm, factual responses were making his own agitated, theatrical questioning appear performative and unserious. The American people understand what's really happening here, he said, abandoning specific claims for a broad appeal to public opinion. These laws are about maintaining election integrity, which voters overwhelmingly support. Crockett nodded again, meeting his appeal with her own data. Public opinion research is indeed relevant to this discussion. Senator, the most recent Pew Research survey found that 84% of Americans, including majorities of both Republicans and Democrats, support ensuring that all eligible citizens have equal access to the ballot. She turned another page in her folder. Interestingly, that same survey found that when voters are informed of the specific provisions in some of these new state laws, such as criminalizing the act of giving water to voters waiting in long lines, or reducing early voting hours in working-class neighborhoods, support for those laws drops significantly across all partisan lines. The methodical presentation of documented facts, from constitutional history to empirical data to public opinion research, had shifted the dynamic of the hearing entirely. What had begun as an attempt by Hawley to question Crockett's authority had instead highlighted her comprehensive command of the subject. Hawley checked the clock on the wall, realizing the exchange was not playing out as he had planned. "My time is almost expired," he said, his voice clipped. "Let me just ask you directly. Do you believe these state legislators are intentionally trying to suppress votes?" It was a final, desperate attempt to bait Crockett into an inflammatory soundbite that could be used against her in conservative media. Crockett paused thoughtfully before responding, refusing to be rushed into the trap. "Senator," she said, her voice measured, "I believe in evaluating laws by their effects, rather than speculating about their intentions. When a law creates documented barriers that disproportionately impact certain communities, be they racial minorities, the elderly, or low-income workers, the Constitution requires us to scrutinize that law, regardless of what its drafters claim to have intended." She closed her folder with a soft, deliberate motion. The Supreme Court established this effects-based standard in decisions from Arlington Heights to Shelby County. "My concern is not with casting aspersions on individual legislators, but with protecting every eligible American's constitutional right to vote, a principle I would hope transcends any partisan differences." The measured, legally sophisticated response denied Hawley the soundbite he sought. "I see my time has expired," he said, a note of clear frustration in his voice. "I yield back, Mr. Chairman." As the chairman called on the next committee member, the atmosphere in the hearing room had transformed. The attempted takedown had failed, and in its place, a new star, grounded in substance and preparation, had just been born on the national stage. The chair recognizes the senior senator from Minnesota for 5 minutes of questioning, the committee chairman announced, his voice attempting to restore the hearing to its normal rhythm. But the rhythm was broken. The predictable pattern of partisan theater had been shattered by the unexpected intrusion of substantive expertise. Several senators on both sides were visibly reviewing their prepared questions, a subtle but clear sign that the ground had shifted beneath them. The usual lines of attack, the rehearsed talking points, suddenly seemed flimsy and inadequate in the wake of the methodical, evidence-based presentation that had just unfolded. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, a seasoned prosecutor herself, adjusted her approach in real time. "Representative Crockett," she began, her tone noticeably respectful, "rather than challenging your qualifications, which you have now clearly and comprehensively established for the committee, I'd like to focus on the specific provisions in these state laws that you believe raise the most serious constitutional concerns." The shift was a quiet but profound victory for Crockett. The debate had been elevated from a personal attack on her authority to a substantive engagement with her actual expertise. Crockett responded with a detailed analysis of specific provisions, citing relevant judicial precedents for each concern, her voice confident and clear. As the hearing continued, a transformation rippled through the committee room. The Republican senators who followed largely abandoned the dismissive, condescending tone Hawley had attempted. Their questions became more focused, more technical, centered on substantive policy disagreements rather than performative attacks. The Democratic senators, for their part, recognized that Crockett had become their most effective messenger. They used their questioning time not to deliver their own prepared remarks, but to ask questions that allowed her to further elaborate on key constitutional points, effectively ceding their time to amplify her expertise. In the press gallery, journalists were frantically editing their planned stories. What was expected to be a routine, forgettable hearing had become something far more newsworthy, a rare, unambiguous moment when substance had triumphed over spectacle in the heart of the congressional theater. Outside the hearing room, in the digital world, the confrontation was already metastasizing into a full-blown viral phenomenon. Clips of the exchange between Hawley and Crockett, particularly the devastating final moments, were accumulating millions of views. Political commentators across the spectrum began to weigh in, with many noting the rarity of seeing genuine, prepared expertise so effectively cut through rehearsed talking points in a live congressional setting. As the hearing concluded, Senator Hawley quickly exited through a side door, a clear sign that he had no interest in facing the press gaggle that had assembled in the hallway. His office would later release a terse, written statement claiming his questions had successfully exposed the partisan nature of the Democrats' federal election takeover bill. But the unedited video evidence, which was now everywhere, told a far different story. Representative Crockett, by contrast, approached the reporters with the same composed, confident demeanor she had displayed throughout the hearing. Today's discussion wasn't about personalities or politics, she told the scrum of journalists. It was about constitutional principles that should transcend our partisan divisions. The right to vote is fundamental to our democracy, and protecting that right should be a shared commitment. When asked specifically about the heated exchange with Senator Hawley, she skillfully declined to criticize him personally, a final act of strategic grace. "I appreciated the senator's questions," she said, "because they allowed me to clarify for the committee some very important constitutional and empirical points about voting rights. That's what these hearings are supposed to be about, a substantive exchange of ideas, not political theater." The measured, issue-focused response further highlighted the very contrast between performance and substance that had defined the entire hearing. The trap that Hawley had set had not just failed, it had backfired, elevating his intended target into a nationally recognized voice of reason and expertise. Back in his Senate office, Senator Hawley's communications team was in crisis mode. The viral clips were generating precisely the wrong kind of attention. Commentators from across the political spectrum, including many conservatives, were not focusing on his intended message about election integrity, but on how thoroughly and calmly his questioning had been dismantled. "We need to change the narrative, and we need to do it now," insisted his communications director, pacing in front of a television replaying the exchange. "Get our allies on cable news to focus on her record, on her most progressive statements. We need to reframe this." But the damage was already done. The unedited video had spread too widely, a raw and unfiltered piece of political theater that allowed viewers to judge the interaction for themselves. The narrative was no longer Hawley's to control. Meanwhile, in her temporary office on the House side of Capitol Hill, Representative Crockett's world had been transformed. Her small staff, accustomed to the diligent but often unnoticed work of a freshman congresswoman, was now fielding a deluge of calls. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and every other major network wanted her for an exclusive interview. The producers of the Sunday morning talk shows were all vying for her first post-hearing appearance. The senior communications advisor for the Democratic caucus is on line 3. Her legislative director said, holding a phone with a look of awe on her face. And Joe Rogan's producer just called. Crockett, however, remained focused. I'm not interested in becoming part of the outrage cycle, she told her staff, who had gathered around her desk. If they want to have a substantive discussion about the constitutional principles of voting rights, I am available. Otherwise, the hearing testimony can speak for itself. It was an unusual response in a political environment that typically rewarded and encouraged confrontational victory laps. But Crockett had already demonstrated that she was not following the usual Washington playbook. Her goal had not been to create a viral moment, but to make a substantive argument. The fact that doing so effectively had become a viral moment was a secondary, if welcome, consequence. By the following morning, the exchange had transcended the typical 24-hour political news cycle and was blossoming into a cultural moment. Major newspapers ran headlines that captured the essence of the confrontation. Preparation meets performance, how Representative Crockett changed a hearing, and, when constitutional expertise enters the room, the Hawley-Crockett exchange. Cable news panels across the political spectrum analyzed the interaction with a rare degree of consensus on the outcome. What made this moment so significant wasn't just that Representative Crockett knew her stuff, observed one veteran CNN analyst. It's that she responded to what was clearly political theater with such an overwhelming amount of substantive information that she forced everyone in the room to engage with the actual constitutional issues at stake. Even on Fox News, the coverage, while more measured, still had to acknowledge the effectiveness of Crockett's approach. Whether you agree with her policy positions or not, noted one conservative commentator, she demonstrated to every law student in America how to handle hostile questioning, not with emotion, but with facts. There's a lesson in that for both sides. Social media platforms saw the emergence of a new trend. Users began posting videos of other experts, scientists, doctors, economists, calmly and factually responding to dismissive or aggressive questioning from politicians and media figures. All under hashtags like #the Crockett Effect and #ReceiptsReady. The congressional hearing had sparked a broader cultural conversation about the value of genuine expertise in public discourse. The methodical dismantling of Senator Hawley's attack had become a template, a symbol of substance triumphing over spectacle. Within 72 hours, the viral exchange had even penetrated popular culture. Late-night comedy shows incorporated references to bringing your Crockett folder as shorthand for being thoroughly prepared. Saturday Night Live featured a sketch portraying the hearing, exaggerating both Hawley's dismissiveness and Crockett's composed, fact-based responses for comedic effect. But beyond the memes and media coverage, something more substantive was happening. Law schools reported a noticeable uptick in applications and increased student interest in constitutional law and voting rights courses. Civic education organizations began developing workshops using clips from the exchange to teach students about effective testimony and the importance of factual preparation in public discourse. 1 week after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett addressed a packed auditorium of law students at her alma mater, the University of Houston Law Center. What happened in that hearing room wasn't about me or Senator Hawley, she told them. It was about the difference between approaching constitutional questions with substantive understanding versus using them as political props. She placed her hand on a stack of constitutional law casebooks. These fundamental principles, equal protection, due process, the right to vote, aren't academic abstractions or partisan talking points. They are the living architecture of our democracy, and they deserve to be discussed with precision and care. 3 weeks after the hearing, an unexpected development occurred. Senator Hawley's office reached out to Representative Crockett's staff, proposing a joint town hall on election procedures in counties along their state's shared border. Political observers were stunned. Crockett agreed to participate, and the subsequent event was a model of substantive, if sometimes contentious, debate. The viral moment had not transformed American politics overnight. Partisan performance still dominated much of Washington's discourse. But something had shifted. A freshman congresswoman had demonstrated that thorough preparation and factual precision could be more powerful than rehearsed outrage. Not just in legal arguments, but in the court of public opinion. In preparation sessions for congressional testimony across Washington, a simple lesson had been absorbed: when performance meets preparation, preparation wins. The confrontation between Representative Crockett and Senator Hawley serves as a compelling case study in the dynamics of modern political communication, highlighting the potent, if often underestimated, power of substantive expertise in an era dominated by performative outrage. Crockett's decisive victory in the exchange can be attributed to several key strategic elements that, together, dismantled her opponent's attack. First and foremost was her refusal to engage on the opponent's terms. Senator Hawley's opening was a classic ad hominem attack, designed to frame the debate around Crockett's perceived lack of credentials and experience rather than the merits of the legislation. An emotional or defensive response would have validated his frame, turning the exchange into a personal squabble. Instead, Crockett calmly and methodically answered his challenge directly, using his question as a platform to establish her extensive qualifications. By refusing to be drawn into an emotional battle, she maintained control of the tone and recentered the conversation on her own terms. Second was the masterful use of asymmetric evidence. Hawley came armed with broad, familiar talking points about founders' intent and election integrity. Crockett, in contrast, came armed with a portfolio of specific, verifiable, and often surprising evidence. She cited not only case law and constitutional history but also data from a conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and public opinion research, the Pew Research Survey. This use of ideologically diverse and empirically grounded evidence made it impossible for Hawley to dismiss her arguments as merely partisan. The most effective use of this was quoting his own data back to him, a tactic that left him with no credible rebuttal. Finally, Crockett's success was cemented by her unwavering composure and professionalism. Throughout the exchange, even as Hawley became visibly frustrated, Crockett remained calm, measured, and focused. Her demeanor projected confidence and authority, reinforcing the substance of her arguments. Her response to his final, baited question, where she explained the effects-based legal standard rather than speculating on intent, was a masterclass in denying an opponent the inflammatory soundbite they seek. By consistently demonstrating a superior command of both the facts and her own temperament, she didn't just win the argument, she won the credibility of the entire exchange. The hearing became a powerful lesson in the arena of public discourse. The most effective response to performative aggression is not more aggression, but overwhelming, undeniable competence. 3 weeks after the hearing, in a high school gymnasium in a politically purple county straddling the Texas-Missouri border, an unlikely event was taking place. The air, thick with the scent of popcorn and simmering political skepticism, was filled with a diverse crowd of farmers, teachers, small business owners, and students. National media had descended, their cameras and satellite trucks forming a perimeter around the school, all of them here to witness the second act of the political drama that had captivated the nation, a joint town hall with Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator Josh Hawley. Hawley had proposed the event, a move that stunned the political establishment. It was a calculated risk, a public attempt to rehabilitate his image from that of a dismissive performer to a substantive legislator. He needed to show that he could engage on the facts, and that the man seen in the viral clips was not the real Josh Hawley. For Crockett, accepting was also a risk. It meant stepping into a potentially hostile environment and testing whether her call for substantive dialogue was a real principle or just a clever debate tactic. The format was designed to de-escalate conflict. They sat not at opposing lecterns, but side by side at a simple table, co-moderating a Q&A session with local citizens. The first question, predictably, was about voting rights. A local county clerk, a woman with 30 years of experience, stood and asked, "Senator Hawley, you spoke of federal overreach, but we struggle with funding for new voting machines. Congresswoman Crockett, you spoke of access, but how do we ensure security without creating burdens?" Hawley was a different man. He was prepared. He spoke not of founders' intent, but of specific logistical challenges faced by rural counties. He acknowledged the need for updated equipment and agreed that funding was a legitimate federal issue. Crockett, in turn, did not speak of modern Jim Crow. She talked about specific, practical solutions: mobile ID stations for the elderly, extended early voting hours on weekends to accommodate hourly workers, and federal grants for machine upgrades. They disagreed on the scope of the federal government's role, but the conversation was about how to solve a problem, not a clash of ideologies. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. A young college student stood. "This question is for both of you," she said. "I watched the hearing on CNN. It felt different. Senator Hawley, why did you start by attacking her qualifications? And Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe that kind of civil discourse is really possible?" The room fell silent. Hawley took a deep breath. This was the moment his entire political future seemed to hang on. "I appreciate that question," he began, looking not at Crockett, but at the student, "and I'll answer it directly. My approach in that hearing was a mistake. I was focused on the political theater of the moment, and I chose to question the Congresswoman's credentials instead of engaging with the substance of her arguments from the start. She came to that hearing far more prepared on the specifics of that bill than I was. And she made her case effectively." He then turned to Crockett. "And for that, I respect her. While we still disagree fundamentally on the federal solution, she forced me, and I think many of us, to re-examine the details." It was a stunning public concession. Crockett, in turn, was gracious. "I appreciate the senator saying that," she said, "and to answer your question, I do believe civil discourse is possible. This, right here, is what it looks like. It's not about agreeing on everything. It's about respecting each other enough to listen and to debate the facts honestly. That's how progress begins." A wave of applause, genuine and relieved, swept through the gymnasium. The tension that had lingered in the air finally broke. The rest of the town hall was a model of substantive debate. But as the event drew to a close, a weathered farmer in the back of the room stood up, his question introducing a new, unexpected, and far more complex challenge. "That's all well and good," he said, his voice a low grumble. "But what are the two of you actually going to do about the water crisis in the Red River Basin? My farm is on the Texas side, but my neighbors on the Missouri side is going bankrupt. We're fighting over water that isn't there. Your two states have been suing each other for a decade with no results. Forget the voting bills. What are you going to do about that?" The farmer's question landed with a thud, puncturing the self-congratulatory atmosphere of the town hall. The room, which had been alight with the novelty of civil discourse, was suddenly plunged into the cold, hard reality of an intractable problem. The national media, sensing a shift from a story about political style to one about policy failure, zoomed their cameras in. This was the real test. Could the newfound respect between Crockett and Hawley survive a confrontation with an actual, complex issue that had stumped politicians for years? Hawley responded first, falling back on his familiar conservative principles. "That's an excellent question," he began, "and it highlights the failure of a top-down, federal approach. For years, the EPA has overstepped its authority, creating a bureaucratic nightmare for farmers and ranchers. The solution isn't more Washington mandates, it's empowering local water authorities and respecting the state's rights to manage their own resources." Crockett followed, her response reflecting her own party's core tenets. "I agree that local stakeholders need a seat at the table, Senator," she said, "but this is a regional crisis, exacerbated by climate change, that crosses state lines. It disproportionately affects smaller, minority-owned farms that don't have the capital to dig deeper wells. This is precisely the kind of interstate issue where a federal framework is necessary to ensure an equitable and sustainable solution for everyone." The audience stirred, a low murmur of disappointment rippling through the gymnasium. They had just witnessed a brief moment of unity, and now it seemed to be dissolving back into the familiar, frustrating gridlock of partisan talking points. Crockett, sensing the moment slipping away, made a bold move. She turned not to the audience, but directly to Hawley. "Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "your constituents are suffering, and my constituents are suffering. The lawsuits have failed. The political posturing has failed. We can stand here and recite our party's talking points, and in another 10 years, that farmer's land will be dust. Or, we can do something different." She leaned forward. "I propose that we, right now, agree to form a bipartisan, bicameral working group, just you and me, and our senior staff. No press, no grandstanding. We lock ourselves in a room, We bring in the engineers and the farmers from both our states. And we don't come out until we have a real legislative solution. What do you say?" The room went silent. It was a direct, public challenge, not to a debate, but to the hard, unglamorous work of governing. Hawley was trapped. To refuse would be to prove he was the obstructionist his critics claimed him to be. To accept would be to risk the ire of his base by collaborating with a progressive Democrat. He was silent for a long moment, the political calculations visibly warring across his face. "I'm always willing to talk solutions, Congresswoman," he said finally, his tone grudging, "but I remain deeply skeptical of another Washington working group." "Then let's prove your skepticism wrong," Crockett replied smoothly. The town hall ended with a cautious, but tangible, sense of hope. The weeks that followed were a quiet, untelevised grind. They met in a small, neutral conference room in the basement of the Capitol, away from the cameras. The first meetings were tense, their staffers eyeing each other with suspicion. But Crockett and Hawley set the tone. They argued over details. They clashed over the role of federal funding versus state control. But they listened. They flew together, on a commercial flight, to the Red River Basin. They walked the dry, cracked earth of the farmers' land who had asked the question. They met with local water boards, with tribal leaders, with agricultural engineers. They saw the human cost of the political stalemate. Slowly, painstakingly, the outlines of a compromise began to emerge. A bill that provided federal funding for new water infrastructure, as Crockett wanted, but gave states significant flexibility in its implementation. As Hawley demanded, it included investments in new, water-saving agricultural technologies and aid for the small farmers who were most at risk. After 2 months of grueling, under-the-radar work, they had a draft. It was not a perfect bill, but it was a real, viable solution. They sat in their conference room, looking at the final text. "It's a good piece of legislation, Jasmine," Hawley admitted, a note of surprise in his voice. "I agree, Josh," she said. "I think this can actually pass." But as they prepared to introduce their bill, a new, more formidable obstacle emerged. A powerful agricultural megacorporation, which had profited for years from the existing water rights agreements, saw the bipartisan bill as a threat to its bottom line. Their army of lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill. Phone calls were made. Campaign donations were promised. Suddenly, senators who had privately expressed support for the Crockett-Hawley compromise grew silent. The committee chairman who had promised to schedule a hearing was now reviewing the language. In their small basement office, Crockett and Hawley looked at the latest report from their staff, detailing the lobbying blitz that was working to kill their bill before it could even get a vote. Hawley leaned back in his chair, a wry, cynical smile on his face. "Well, Congresswoman," he said, "it was a nice idea. But we're about to find out what happens when a fragile, bipartisan effort meets a real Washington power player. This is where these things usually die." Hawley's cynical pronouncement hung in the air of the small basement office. A cold dose of Washington realism. "This is where these things usually die." It was the voice of a man who had seen countless good faith efforts get crushed by the weight of money and influence. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She looked at the report detailing the lobbying blitz, then back at Hawley, her expression not of defeat, but of renewed determination. "Maybe this is where they usually die, Senator," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But our constituents are counting on us. That farmer who stood up in your town hall isn't interested in the usual way things die in Washington. He's interested in not losing his farm. We're not going to let that happen." In the weeks that followed, they were plunged into the brutal, unseen warfare of Washington politics. An army of lobbyists from the agricultural megacorporation, Agricor, descended upon Capitol Hill. Dark money-funded attack ads began running in the home states of key committee members, bizarrely framing the bipartisan water bill as both a socialist water grab and a giveaway to corporate interests, depending on the audience. The effect was immediate and corrosive. Senators who had privately praised the Crockett-Hawley compromise now became noncommittal. The committee chairman, once enthusiastic, was now perpetually reviewing the language. The bill was being suffocated in its cradle. The pressure on Hawley was immense. He received a call from a major party donor, a man whose checks had funded his last campaign. "Josh," the donor said, his voice a smooth, friendly threat, "Agricor is a great American company and a friend to the party. This bill of yours is causing them some real headaches. We need to be team players here." The old Hawley, the political brawler, would have seen his opening. He could have abandoned the bill, blamed Crockett and the Democrats for overreach, and emerged as a hero to the corporate interests in his party. His staff urged him to do just that. But as he sat in his office, the donor's words echoing in his ears, he thought of the farmer in the gymnasium. He remembered the look on the faces of the people in that crowd, a desperate hope that something, for once, could actually get done. He picked up the phone and called Crockett. "They're coming at us hard," he said, foregoing any pleasantries. "My own party is telling me to walk away." "Mine too," Crockett replied. "The Progressive Caucus thinks I gave away too much. They're calling it a corporate giveaway." "So, what do we do?" Hawley asked. "We fight," Crockett said simply, "but not in the back rooms. We take this public, you and me, together." The next day, they held a joint press conference in the Senate studio, a visual so rare and so powerful that every major network carried it live. It was a stunning display of their combined strengths. Crockett, with her lawyerly precision, laid out the facts of the water crisis and the specifics of their bill, dismantling the lies from the attack ads one by one. Then it was Hawley's turn. But instead of the angry populist, a different version emerged. He was fiery, but his anger was now directed at the crony capitalists and swamp creatures in his own party who, he thundered, would rather see a farmer's land turn to dust than risk a penny of their lobbyist-funded profits. He was using the language of his base, but aiming it at a new target. The press conference was a political earthquake. The story was no longer just about a water bill. It was about an unlikely, bipartisan alliance taking on the entire corrupt system of Washington. Their offices were flooded with calls of support from ordinary citizens across the country. The battle was far from over, but the dynamic had shifted. The bill was no longer dying a quiet death in the back rooms. It was now at the center of a national fight. The committee chairman, under immense public pressure, had no choice but to schedule a vote. The evening before the vote, Crockett and Hawley met one last time in the quiet basement office. The fate of their bill, and of their fragile alliance, was uncertain. "Tomorrow," Hawley said, looking more tired than Crockett had ever seen him, "we find out if an actual solution can beat a mountain of money." "I have faith, Senator," Crockett replied, "not in the system, but in the people we're fighting for." They stood, two former adversaries from different worlds, united by a common purpose. The vote was just hours away. The morning of the committee vote, the hearing room was once again a theater of high-stakes political drama. The room was packed. In the back, the tailored suits of the Agricor lobbyists stood in a confident cluster. In the front rows sat the farmer who had asked the question at the town hall, surrounded by dozens of other farmers from both Texas and Missouri who had traveled to Washington to witness the bill's fate. The media was out in full force, and the nation was watching. The debate before the vote was tense. A senior Republican on the committee, known to be a major recipient of Agricor's campaign donations, spoke first, reciting the lobbyists' talking points about crippling government overreach and punishing American innovation. Then, it was Hawley's turn. He stood, and a hush fell over the room. "Mr. Chairman," he began, his voice firm, "I am a conservative. I believe in limited government and the power of the free market. But the free market is not a free pass for crony capitalist corporations to use their power to crush the American farmer." He looked at the lobbyists in the back of the room. "I have heard from the so-called friends of the party, who tell me this bill is a mistake. But the real friends of my party, the real friends of this country, are the men and women who work the land, and they are being destroyed. This bill is not a perfect solution, but it is a real solution, forged not by lobbyists, but by listening to the people we serve." He looked at Crockett, "And I am proud to stand with the Congresswoman in this fight." Crockett spoke last. She did not talk about politics or lobbyists. She simply told the story of the farmers she had met, of the families losing their land, of the communities drying up. We were sent here to solve problems, she concluded, her voice quiet but powerful. This bill solves a problem. The choice before this committee is simple. Are we here to serve the special interests? Or are we here to serve the people? The chairman called for the vote. The roll call began, and the tally was neck and neck. It all came down to a single, wavering moderate from a Midwestern state who had been heavily pressured by the lobbyists. When his name was called, he paused for a long, agonizing moment. I have heard from the lobbyists, he said, looking at the farmers in the front row. But I have also heard from the people. I vote aye. The bill passed the committee. The room exploded. The farmers erupted in cheers, some openly weeping with relief. The Agricorps lobbyists stood in stunned silence before turning and filing out of the room, their faces grim. After the chaos subsided, Crockett and Hawley met in the now empty hallway. They simply looked at each other for a moment. Two unlikely allies who had taken on the swamp and won. Well, Senator, Crockett said with a small, tired smile, looks like sometimes these things don't die after all. Hawley allowed himself a rare, genuine grin. Don't get used to it, Congresswoman, he replied. They shook hands. It was not the handshake of political allies, but of two professionals who had earned a deep and profound respect for one another. The Crockett-Hawley Water Rights Act, as it came to be known, would go on to pass the full House and Senate with broad bipartisan support and be signed into law. It became a landmark piece of legislation, a testament to the fact that even in a deeply divided Washington, substantive, bipartisan problem-solving was still possible. The Phoenix moment had done more than create a viral clip, it had, against all odds, created a new precedent. The confrontation between Representative Crockett and her opponents, first Dershowitz and then Hawley, serves as a powerful case study in the evolving dynamics of political power and persuasion. Crockett's success was not accidental but was rooted in a series of strategic choices that systematically dismantled the traditional weapons of her adversaries. At its core was the triumph of preparation over reputation. Both Dershowitz and Hawley entered their respective confrontations relying on their status, Dershowitz as an intellectual titan, Hawley as a skilled political brawler. They assumed this reputation would be enough to intimidate and overwhelm a freshman congresswoman. Crockett, in contrast, came armed not with her own status, but with a deep and granular knowledge of both the subject matter and her opponent's own histories. By quoting Dershowitz's past writings and Hawley's own preferred data sources, she turned their own intellectual and political foundations against them. It was a clinical demonstration that in an era of information, a meticulously prepared argument is more powerful than a formidable reputation. Second was her masterful use of strategic restraint. In both confrontations, her opponents began with aggressive, ad hominem attacks designed to provoke an emotional response. A shouting match would have played to their strengths and created a chaotic, both sides, narrative for the media. Crockett consistently refused to take the bait. Her calm, composed demeanor in the face of condescension and insult created a stark visual and tonal contrast. It framed her as the sober, serious adult in the room, and her opponents as emotional and unprofessional. This restraint was not passive, it was an active strategy that allowed her opponents to exhaust themselves in the process, expose the weakness of their own positions. Finally, the narrative highlights the power of pivoting from conflict to collaboration. After decisively winning the debate against Dershowitz, Crockett did not engage in a victory tour. Instead, she extended an olive branch, proposing the joint op-ed. Similarly, after Hawley conceded, she accepted his proposal for a town hall. This was a brilliant move that elevated her above the fray of partisan politics. It demonstrated that her ultimate goal was not to win a fight, but to solve a problem. By transforming her adversaries into, however temporary, collaborators, she not only cemented her moral authority but also achieved a tangible legislative victory that would have been impossible through conflict alone. It was a sophisticated display of turning a political win into a governing opportunity. A rare and powerful skill in modern politics. The story of Jasmine Crockett's rise from an underestimated freshman to a nationally recognized leader offers a compelling blueprint for a new model of political leadership in a deeply polarized age. It suggests that the public, weary of constant partisan warfare and performative outrage, is hungry for a different kind of leader, one grounded in substance, civility, and a genuine commitment to problem solving. The narrative arc demonstrates a profound shift in what constitutes political strength. The old model, represented by the initial attacks from Dershowitz and Hawley, defined strength as dominance, aggression, and the ability to humiliate an opponent. Crockett's success suggests a new definition: strength as unwavering composure, intellectual rigor, and the courage to find common ground. Her power was derived not from shouting the loudest, but from knowing the most and communicating that knowledge with clarity and conviction. This resonates with a public that is increasingly exhausted by a political culture that rewards conflict over competence. Furthermore, the story is a testament to the idea that lived experience is a form of expertise. Crockett repeatedly drew upon her background as a public defender and civil rights attorney to ground abstract constitutional debates in the real-world consequences for ordinary people. This was her most effective weapon against the ivory tower arguments of her opponents. It demonstrated that true understanding comes not just from academic study, but from direct engagement with the human impact of the law. In an era of increasing distance between the political class and the people they represent, her ability to bridge that gap with authentic, experience-based arguments was a source of immense power and credibility. Ultimately, the journey from the CNN studio to the successful passage of the Red River Basin Bill is a story of hope. It suggests that bipartisan cooperation is not a naive fantasy, but a difficult, achievable goal. The key, as demonstrated by the narrative, is moving beyond personal attacks and ideological purity tests to a shared focus on a tangible problem. The Crockett-Hawley alliance was not born from a sudden ideological alignment, but from a shared recognition that their constituents' suffering was more important than their political differences. This story, while fictional, provides a powerful and optimistic model for how our politics could, and perhaps should, work. It is a reminder that the most effective leaders are not always the ones who fight the loudest, but the ones who build the most bridges.